Renee, and today I'm talking about what calligraphy nibs are and how they work. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to stick with pointed flexible nibs and broad edge calligraphy nibs. There's other types out there, but these are just to get us started here. And I'll leave the titles of the nibs that I'm working with in the information below. So what I'll go over is how they work, and then I'll also go over basic care for nibs. So let's get started. So here we are with a pointed flexible nib. It comes to a sharp point here at the end, and I do mean sharp. It will cause you physical injury if you're not careful. There's a slit from the tip of the nib all the way up to this hole here, which is the reservoir. You'll hear this called the eye of the needle or the vent, but that's how far you dip the nib, and that's where extra ink goes. So this slit from the tip of the nib to the reservoir divides the nib into what are called tines. And so when you're putting pressure on the tines, they open, and ink will travel from the reservoir down the tines, and it spreads across the space in between them and travels down to the paper. So if I were writing, the area between the 2 points of the nib now would be how wide the stroke is. And if I keep the tines closed and I'm writing, then it's just going to make a fine line. Okay, and now here we are with my first love, which is broad edge calligraphy. So again, they're similar to a pointed nib. They're still flexible, but not as flexible. And you can see that it has a flat edge here. They each do. This is a Mitchell nib, and this is a Speedball nib. Now, I'm sliding it to the edge of the table so I can pick it up by the back of the nib. You don't want to touch the tines. So again, there's a slit from the very tip of the nib all the way to the reservoir. Here on the Mitchell, it has a divot in the middle. They do come with a little reservoir that attaches to the bottom of the nib, but I find that this really holds enough ink for my purposes. So anyway, the tines split too. Here with the Speedball, these come with a reservoir attached to the top of them, and they are not removable. If you remove this, then the nib will never be the same, trust me. So Speedball nibs have 3 tines. I wish this would focus. Speedball nibs have 3 tines. See? And they mimic a quill. I mean, all nibs mimic a quill for writing calligraphy, but these ones are more closely because quills are much more flexible than metal nibs are. Damaged nibs. I already said earlier in the video that I handle nibs by sliding them just right side up to the edge of the table, and once the back of the nib is hanging off the edge of the table, then I'll pinch it and I'll pick it up that way. So when the tines get damaged, what happens is the ink can't travel properly down the nib to the page, but also the tines aren't going to make the shapes that you need for calligraphy, and the ink is just going to blob everywhere. So for example, this one of the tines is bent so far that it's just not going to be the same. You can see, compared with the Speedball from earlier, where it's just one uniform edge here, this one the tines are already open. So I'm never going to get a clean line like I would with this, because ink is just going to spit out everywhere. With this Hunt pen, I'll handle it by the tines just because it's so damaged. The tines are crossed. I had left this in a holder, and I was trying to get it out, and I, by mistake, handled it too roughly, and the tines crossed. And so, again, the nib is never going to be the same. Ink will never travel down it the way that it's supposed to. A couple things to know about how to care for your nibs once you start working with them. They do come with, I mean, it's a clear coat of like oil that prevents the nibs from rusting until someone wants to use them. It's just like a protective finish that rinses off really easily with soap and water, or just saliva. If you just keep it on your fingers, and it'll dissolve the protective coating. So that will need to be removed, because again, it's preventing the nib from getting rusted, so your ink will not adhere to the nib enough to stay on it for you to write. So you may have to do this a couple of times just to make sure that everything gets removed from the nib. Also, I tend to leave my nibs in the pen staffs until I can't use them anymore. I have a few pen staffs so I can keep a few nibs in rotation, but I tend to leave them there just so that I don't handle them too much and they don't get too damaged. If you're only working with if you're working with just your one holder, I would suggest removing the nib from the holder after each use, just because ink can dry around this part of the nib and it can get really stuck in the holder. So you want to prevent that as much as you can. It's also important to wipe your nib as you're working, because even though we're working with the nib, ink can still dry on it. It'll dry, I mean, of course, on the nib, but also in between the tines. And also the nib can pick up fibers from the paper as you're writing. So it's a good practice to just wipe it clean as you're working with it. So I think that's all I have to say about nibs. I hope that this was informative for you. If you have questions about anything or video suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments section below. And have fun.